Hello, and welcome to tonight's episode of Untold Stories of World War II. Tonight we will be discussing the story of Lieutenant General James F. Hollingsworth. And our guest speaker is actually joining us from Hawaii tonight. But as some of you know, I like to see where all of our guests are streaming in from. So if you could go ahead and type in the chat box where you are streaming in from, go ahead and give some shout outs. We've got Nebraska in the house. I see Dallas, Fredericksburg, California, hello, Alabama, uh, Denton, got Garland, Magnolia, oh, Virginia, I see you. I'm going to introduce our guest speaker for the evening. As I said, he's coming to us from Hawaii tonight. His name is Dr. James Willbanks, and he was commissioned at A&M, just like our topic for tonight, and is also a Vietnam veteran. So I'm going to go ahead and hand over the reins to Jim.
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate the invitation here to speak about a very interesting individual. It's my pleasure to talk about a legendary combat leader, a Texan, a fellow Texas Aggie, and a true patriot. He is a three-time recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest award for valor. He also had 4 Silver Stars and 6 Purple Hearts. His career spanned the pre-World War years through World War II and into the Vietnam War and the post-Vietnam Cold War years in Korea. He was known as a hard-charging, hands-on leader who could be irreverent and brash, but always led from the front. During World War II, General George S. Patton said that Holly, as he was also known, was one of the 2 best armor battalion commanders in the entire war, which was quite an accolade, particularly coming from Patton. In 2 tours in Vietnam, he achieved almost legendary status. He became known as his radio call sign, Danger 79er. And he went by that. That was his informal name for the rest of his life by all who knew and worked with him. After Vietnam, he was reassigned to Korea, where he commanded all of the U.S. forces, the largest field army in the world, and is really the story of one of the most decorated soldiers in the history of the United States Army. He's 3rd on the VFW's list of most decorated Americans without the Medal of Honor. He was a man who demonstrated uncommon valor and a rare level of leadership in nearly 4 decades of service to the nation. And he is a Texan. He was born on 24 March 1918, the first son of James Newton Hollingsworth and Mamie Ella Hollingsworth. In his early years, he lived with his mother and father on the family farm 7 miles northwest of Sanger, Texas, which is, of course, north of Denton. He and his 3 younger brothers, Cecil, Ross, and Gerald, grew up on the farm where they all learned the value of hard work. They attended Union Hill School, a small country school, and then eventually transferred to Sanger High School, where Holly played football and basketball and ran track. He was also extremely active in the Future Farmers of America. After he graduated from Sanger High, he attended North Texas Agricultural College in Arlington, Texas. In the fall of 1937, he transferred to Agricultural Mechanical College of Texas, Texas A&M, in College Station. There, of course, as all students who attended A&M at that time, he was required to join the Corps of Cadets. He was also active in intramural sports and also at the same time worked at the campus creamery. In March 1940, he married a hometown girl from Sanger, Catherine Nicky Nicholson, daughter of the Sanger postmaster. In May 1940, he graduated from Texas A&M and was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant in the infantry. In the pre-war years, he was first assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, where he joined the famed, or what would become the famed 2nd Armored Division, a new division that had just been formed at Fort Benning. There at Benning, he was also exposed to Colonel George S. Patton, who had a large impact on Holly's view of leadership and leading men in war. Having been transferred to the armor branch from infantry, Holly was assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 68th Armor. He participated in training with the division as storm clouds began to grow in Europe. During this period, he also attended automotive school at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where he learned about tank maintenance, which would come in handy after the war started. During this time, Nicky gave birth to James Francis Hollingsworth II, who became known as Jamie and immediately became the apple of his father's eye. The 2nd Armored Division continued to prepare for war, participating in large-scale multi-division maneuvers in Tennessee, Louisiana, Carolina, and the Mojave Desert. With the outbreak and spread of war in Europe, Holly and the 2nd Armored Division received orders to prepare for movement. No one was sure where they were going, but it eventually came clear that the 2nd Armored Division would be landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch in November 1942. There, he and the division got their first taste of live combat. They landed at Casablanca in French Morocco, but the fighting was relatively light. By the middle of May in 1943, the Allies had prevailed in North Africa. Allied attention then turned to Sicily, where the Allies would conduct an amphibious landing called Operation Husky. The operation began on 10 July 1943, and during the course of the landing and subsequent operations, Holly, now promoted to major, acted as the regimental maintenance officer for the 67th Armored Regiment, chosen primarily for his experience and schooling at Fort Knox in tank maintenance. During the fighting, Holly's Jeep hit a mine, but he suffered only a slight concussion. This was only the first time that he would be injured in combat. The fighting ended in Sicily on 17 August 1943. After Husky was completed, 2nd Armored Division and the other units involved in the Sicily campaign were ordered to board troop transports from the ports to the ports of Liverpool in England and Greenock in Scotland. Once in England, the division began to undergo refitting, receive new troops, and began intensive training. It soon became clear that the training was in preparation for the invasion of the European continent. When the invasion began in June, the 2nd Armored was initially held in reserve and did not land on Normandy Beach until mid-June. Once in France, the division, along with Holly's regiment, took part in Operation Cobra, the breakout from the Normandy beachhead. This area was characterized by fields and bocage, or hedgerows, that impeded armor movement. It was very difficult initially for the armored elements in the U.S. and British forces to move through this terrain, and a sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division fabricated a hedgerow cutter made out of heavy steel prongs salvaged from dismantled German anti-tank beach obstacles. Once mounted on the tanks, these devices allowed the Americans to plow through the hedgerows without exposing the tank's vulnerable belly. Once the lodgment had been expanded in Normandy, the 2nd Armored and the other Allied units prepared to launch the attack eastward across France toward Germany. The 2nd Armored Division advanced rapidly across France, covering 125 miles in about a week, destroying 64 tanks and 538 other combat vehicles during the operation. Holly was all over the battlefield and had a number of opportunities to employ tanks to overcome enemy pockets of resistance as the trains moved forward. The combat trains were essentially the maintenance trail for the forward elements. Although he was the executive officer, that meant he had control of the trains, but he had every opportunity to move forward to get involved directly in the combat. These small actions only whetted his appetite for the main fight that was going on at the tip of the division's spearhead. He would soon get his chance to join the fray. The 2nd Armored Division continued its attack eastward, reaching the Belgian border in the first week of September. By mid-month, the division had crossed the Albert Canal into Germany. The 2nd Armored had then focused on the Siegfried Line and the Ruhr Basin. At this time, Holly was reassigned as the executive officer of the 2nd Battalion of the 67th Armored. The battalion and regiment continued to move eastward in a slow and savage struggle against the mud, rain, snow, and determined German defenders. As the battalion tried to take a town on the Roar River, Holly was wounded by shrapnel from a German artillery shell. But after getting patched up, he continued to fight with his unit. Having fought a series of desperate battles along the Roar, the Allies breached the Siegfried Line. In bitter fighting, the 2nd Armored Division suffered 126 killed, 737 wounded, and 36 missing. In October, Holly's unit was ordered into a reserve position to rest and refit. On 6 November, the regiment was ordered to continue the attack across the Roar. Holly and his unit encountered stiff resistance from German Tiger tanks. Holly at one point ordered what was known as a time on target, where supporting artillery was timed to fall on the enemy simultaneously. This tactic resulting in knocking out 18 Tiger tanks, and Holly's unit surged forward in the advance. On 16 December, during a blinding snowstorm, German General von Rundstedt launched a massive new counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest into Belgium and the tip of northern Luxembourg. Before the Allies could react, the Germans had forged a salient, which became known as the Bulge, in Allied lines. The 2nd Armored was ordered to turn south to join the battle in the Ardennes forest. After a march of nearly 100 miles that took 22 hours, the 2nd Armored Division, along with Holly's regiment, entered the fight. During the course of the battle, Holly's battalion commander was wounded and he assumed command of the battalion. He was 25 years old. As his unit approached the town of Celles, Holly was wounded again, and again the medics patched him up so he could stay in the fight. On 11 January, as the unit approached the town of Samry, Holly was wounded for a 4th time. Shrapnel from a German artillery shell cut off his thumb and peppered him with numerous other wounds. He was seriously wounded but would not leave the battlefield until he was ordered to do so. He was evacuated to Paris and then on to England. After several weeks of recovery, he went AWOL from the hospital in England and made his way back to his unit in Belgium. He was afraid he was going to miss the fighting. In the early morning hours of 23 February, U.S. forces reached and crossed the Rhine River. Holly's unit advanced rapidly but ran into pockets of heavy resistance. During this time, Holly achieved almost legendary status among his troops. He was bold, aggressive, and absolutely fearless. In one occasion, he personally led an attack on a building and included some German snipers. Leading other soldiers, he in the front, brandishing his .45, he took the German snipers captured. On 11 April, Holly's battalion reached the Elbe River. Near the town of Schonebach, Holly and his tanks were involved in a pitched battle over a bridge across the river. During the course of the battle, Holly took a bullet in the knee and was evacuated to the rear once again. Shortly thereafter, U.S. troops were halted at the Elbe while the Soviets captured Berlin. Victory in Europe was declared on 8 May 1945. At this point, Holly had been in combat almost constantly since his arrival in North Africa in December 1942. He had fought across 2 continents and 8 countries. In the process, he had received a Distinguished Cross, 4 Silver Stars, and 4 Bronze Stars, and he had also received 4 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in battle. He was 26 years old. The post-war years were a very interesting time for soldiers who stayed in the military. Many soldiers got out, went home, and went about their normal business. Hollingsworth was one of those who stayed in the service. In the immediate post-war years, he was assigned to the Cavalry School at Fort Riley, Kansas, and been back to Germany, where he served in the U.S. Constabulary, which were basically occupation troops, and then helped stand up the 7th Army headquarters that would supervise the buildup of U.S. forces in Europe as part of NATO. After that, he was assigned to the Command and General Staff College as a student, followed by an assignment as the Chief of Tactics at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where he was a TAC officer. He was legendary among the West Point cadets for his approach to teaching leadership and leading from the front. And in the process was fairly profane in the way he described how to be a leader. But that, again, was part of Holly's style. After West Point, he was assigned to the Pentagon, where he worked for the Army staff that was trying to combat the downsizing Army by the Eisenhower administration. He was then sent as a student to the Army War College in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. He then had a very unique assignment to the U.S. Army element of the Military Assistance Advisory Group in Pakistan. There he made friends with General Ayub Khan, who would eventually take over the country in a bloodless coup. In August 1959, Holly, Nikki, and Jamie headed for Fort Hood, Texas. He was first assigned to the 1st Armored Division and then as Chief of Staff of his old unit, the 2nd Armored Division. As a matter of note, I was a high school kid at Copper's Cove on the other side of what was then Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos. In fact, my dad was in the 13th Armored Battalion, which was part of the 1st Armored Division when General Hollingsworth was in charge. On the evening of 9 October 1960, tragedy struck the Hollingsworth family when Jamie, then a senior at Colleen High School, was mortally injured in an auto accident on North Fort Hood. He died in the hospital the next day. The loss of their only son was devastating to the Hollingsworth. Overcome by grief, Holly pushed himself even harder at work. In August 1961, Holly was again assigned to the Pentagon. There he found himself in a unique position where he was named Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower, Reserve Affairs. It was unusual for a military man to be appointed to a cabinet-level position in the Pentagon, but he had been handpicked for the job by Assistant Secretary of Defense Norman Paul. In this job, Holly had to give orders and direction to officers much senior to him, but as Holly was wont to do, he did not shrink from this duty as he did not shrink from any duty that was assigned. During this assignment, he was deeply involved in revamping the National Guard and the reserves and played a major role in revitalizing the ROTC program. Although he enjoyed his time in DOD, the war in Vietnam was beginning to escalate, and he requested reassignment to Southeast Asia. Holly joined the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam in March 1966. The 1st Division was one of the first U.S. ground divisions deployed to Vietnam in 1965. The division was responsible for the area north and west of Saigon that included the infamous Iron Triangle, as well as War Zones C and D, traditional strongholds of the Viet Cong. Holly was promoted to Brigadier General. Before he left the station, he would become the Assistant Division Commander of the Big Red One, as the division was known. It is at this time that he took the call sign Danger 79er that would stay with him for the rest of his military career. Holly's division commander was Major General Bill Depew, a quiet but intense and hard-charging World War II veteran himself. He was a man who had little patience for incompetence. He was in many ways a difficult man to work for. He did not know Holly when he arrived in the division. Upon meeting Holly, he told him, "General, I want only the best for my division. I don't want any softies on my staff. If you can't hack it out here, just pack your bags and go back home." Holly, no shrinking violet, grinned and replied, "I'll let you know if I can't handle a job, but don't bother looking for a replacement. You won't need one." Depew stared at him in silence and finally said, "Okay, we'll find out." From that somewhat testy beginning, Depew and Hollingsworth developed a close personal and professional relationship that made the 1st Infantry Division one of the most potent fighting forces in Vietnam. It was during this time that he adopted the radio call sign that I've already mentioned, Danger 79er, and that would stay with him for the rest of his career. He worried about only 2 things: the mission and taking care of the troops, his little fellers, as he called them. He had a common touch that endeared him to the enlisted soldiers in the division. They loved him and believed that he would do anything to take care of them. When they were in a firefight, they knew that Danger 79er would be there with everything they needed to prevail in the battle. He built a loyalty among his soldiers that lasted long after the war was over. While his troops may have loved him, he often got himself in trouble with the media. He did not pull any punches and could come across as a bit bloodthirsty, to say the least. A lot of it was theater, much like Patton. for the benefit of the troops, but it sometimes did not come across well in the media. Holly had no filters for anyone, and this would be a problem later in his career as well. Nevertheless, Holly didn't let it bother him as he charged forward. He was tireless, got little sleep, spent nights and days in the air over the battlefield, often landing in the middle of firefights to help his troops out. He was in 2 helicopter crashes during this tour, but that didn't slow him down. In June of 1967, Holly's tour in Vietnam was up and he returned to the States. He was first assigned to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, but shortly after arriving there, he was sent to take command of the training center at Fort Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina. There, he was responsible for training troops for Vietnam. Just having come from combat in Vietnam, he was the right man to revamp the training there and make it more relevant and realistic. After a successful tour there, he was sent to assume command of U.S. Army Alaska. Always an avid hunter and fisherman, he really enjoyed his tour there. In 1971, he again felt the need to get back to Vietnam. He was born for war, and the war in Vietnam was still raging, so there was no other place that he would rather be. Nixon's Vietnamization program had been ongoing since 1969, and many of the U.S. ground troops had been withdrawn as the war was being handed over to the South Vietnamese. By this time, the U.S. Army in Vietnam was in bad shape. Creighton Abrams, the commander of U.S. troops in Saigon, assigned Holly to 24 Corps in Military Region 1, the area just south of the DMZ in northern South Vietnam. There had been several incidents in the region, not the least of which was a fire base that had been overrun by the VC. There was a suspicion that drugs had been involved in the lack of security that had led to the U.S. casualties in the battle. Abrams told Holly, quote, to get up to 24 Corps and get it sorted out, unquote. Holly moved out as ordered and began to shake up things in his new command. As he began to make some progress in sorting it out, Abrams called and told him that he was needed more elsewhere. There was intelligence that the enemy was planning something big. Abrams ordered Holly to Long Binh to assume command of the 3rd Regional Assistance Command. As such, he would be the advisor to the South Vietnamese 3 Corps commander and would also direct the advisory teams with the 3 ARVN divisions and the 11 province teams in Military Region 3. This was the 11 provinces that surrounded Saigon. Holly arrived in Long Binh and began to make an assessment of the situation. The question was, could the Vietnamese stand on their own if the North Vietnamese launched a new major offensive? That question would soon be asked in a much more direct way, and Hollingsworth would be in the thick determining the answer. On Good Friday, 31 March 1972, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive with 130,000 soldiers. The attacks were focused on Quang Tri in the north, and in the central highlands in Kon Tum, and in the area around northwest of Saigon at An Loc, capital of Bien Long Province in Military Region 3, the area for which Hollingsworth was responsible in his new job. The assault on An Loc began with a preliminary attack on the district town of Loc Ninh between An Loc and the Cambodian border. Loc Ninh fell in 48 hours, and the North Vietnamese B-2 front, consisting of 3 divisions, about 45,000 men, moved to surround An Loc. An Loc was a province capital that was 65 miles from Saigon. Inside the city were 4,500 ARVN defenders and their small handful of U.S. advisors, of which I was one. This is where I would come into contact with Hollingsworth for the first time. The North Vietnamese plan was to encircle the city while cutting off the highway to the south in order to lay siege to the city and ultimately to overrun it. What resulted was an almost 3-month-long battle that was marked by massive artillery barrages and repeated human wave attacks supported by tanks. Above the battle daily, almost hourly, Holly directed the advisors on the ground and made sure that they had all the combat support to help the South Vietnamese defenders hold off the attackers. He was over the city in his helicopter, providing encouragement to the advisors, gathering intel, and planning for the next enemy attack, directing resources to support the South Vietnamese and their advisors. He was in his element. Although the Arvin Corps commander was titularly in charge because the defenders were his troops, Holly all but took over the fight, providing advice to the Arvin Corps commander and directing all the U.S. support he could muster. The North Vietnamese made two concerted large-scale attacks in April. The greatly outnumbered Arvin, there were about 4,500 Arvin and about 35,000 North Vietnamese, held out while Holly directed massive amounts of tactical air support and B-52s against the attackers. This is what Holly was born for, directing men in desperate battle. It was the war he came to fight, and he flourished in the role. The high point for the North Vietnamese was on 10 May when they launched a massive attack with 9 regiments. Holly had read the intelligence right and foresaw this attack. Accordingly, he planned a B-52 strike every 55 minutes, starting at 0500 on 10 May. The North Vietnamese attack almost overwhelmed the attackers, but eventually the B-52 strikes broke the enemy's back and they had to withdraw. An Loc had survived, and Holly had played a major role in turning back the enemy in a desperate battle of an intensity not seen before in the war. All of us who were on the ground will never forget General Hollingsworth for all that he did to ensure our survival in An Loc. I am not sure the city would have survived if he had not been the man in command. Unknown to anyone else, early in the battle, Holly had sustained an eye injury from a near burst of an enemy anti-aircraft shell near his helicopter when he was orbiting over the city during a battle. In considerable pain, he did not tell anyone. But with the battle in An Loc over, he went to an Army ophthalmologist in Saigon. The doctor told him that he had a 90% detached retina in the right eye and immediately evacuated him to the Walter Reed Hospital in the States. He had directed a victorious battle, but he had paid a cost for it. Now he was fighting another battle. In considerable pain, he underwent 3 operations, which left him with limited sight in one eye. The old soldier was sure his long and illustrious career was over. General Abrams, who by this time was the Army Chief of Staff, visited Holly in the hospital. Abrams told him he was sending him to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, to rest up. Holly replied that he was probably going to lose his eye and was thinking about retiring. Abrams was having none of that and told him in his usual salty way, "I'll tell you what to do. You don't tell me. I'd rather have you with one eye than most people with 2. You keep your mouth shut, you SOB, because I am going to give you that tactical army command in Korea and promote you to lieutenant general. Now go down there and get rested up. You sorry?" And I will leave the expletive out here. Holly was ecstatic. He thought he was going to have to retire, but he continued at Fort Sam Houston and continued his convalescence while acting as the deputy commander of 5th Army. He was promoted to 3 stars, lieutenant general, on 1 July 1973, and departed for his new command in the Republic of Korea. Holly took command of I Corps Group, a combined U.S. and Republic of Korea headquarters. It was the largest field army in the world, consisting of 13 divisions and 185,000 Korean and American troops. Holly arrived on the scene and took charge in his usual fashion, shaking things up and letting everyone know that a new kind of commander was in charge. His headquarters was charged with planning for the defense of South Korea against an attack from North Korea. Holly didn't like what he saw when he arrived, so he set about to change things, starting with a defense plan which he directed to be revised. He thought the plan was too defensive. To Holly, the best defense was a good offense. He moved all of his artillery forward and repositioned the forces so they could counterattack if the North Koreans came south. As usual, he was everywhere, leading from the front, pushing and encouraging to get things done in a quick fashion. He did not know how to do anything any differently. Since most of the command was Korean, Holly had a lot of dealings with both senior Korean officers as well as ordinary Korean soldiers on the ground. He won their respect for his energy and dedication to duty. The Koreans found it difficult to pronounce Hollingsworth, so they called him Ho Lim Soo, roughly translated, dignified tiger in the forest. He was pretty happy with that name. During the course of his time in country, Hollingsworth left his mark on Korea, and Korea left its mark on Hollingsworth. He was dedicated to the Korean people. He told President Chung Hee Park that he was in Korea for one reason, to defend against attack, and he was prepared to die to save Korea if it came to that. Not surprisingly, President Park became a good friend and one of Holly's biggest supporters. Despite all that he had done in Korea and throughout his illustrious career, Holly received notification that I Corps would be his last assignment and that he was to prepare to retire from active duty. On 12 February 1976, Lieutenant General Hollingsworth passed the flag to the incoming commander, Lieutenant General John H. Cushman, and headed for the States. Many were shocked by the end of this legendary career. One journalist wrote, quote, "If there was a war, Holly, would definitely get a promotion and a 4-star, unquote. Another wrote, quote, "If GIs were fighting somewhere in the world, chances are better than even that Hollingsworth would get a 4-star and a new command. Instead, he is headed for the bench to give peace a chance because the United States had run out of wars," unquote. Senator Lloyd Benson from Texas stood before the U.S. Senate on 18 February 1976 and said, "General Hollingsworth, at 57, is a legend within the U.S. Army. He is a soldier who first demonstrated his capabilities in defending the Siegfried Line in 1944. His leadership then was, as it remains today, complete, deeply respected, and capable of instilling confidence in all whom it touches. General Hollingsworth has served the nation well. It has made great demands on him, and he has risen to every challenge. I salute this distinguished Aggie. I welcome him home to Texas, and I wish him well in his future endeavors." As it turned out, the old soldier was not done serving his country. His retirement was delayed when he was assigned as a special assistant to the Army Chief of Staff. In that capacity, Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia and head of the Senate Armed Services Committee asked Holly to go to Europe and evaluate the capability and potential of U.S. and NATO forces to meet the threat of the Soviets and their Warsaw Pact allies in Central Europe. Holly traveled all over Europe and did not like what he saw. Upon returning, he wrote a scathing report on Allied capabilities that he presented to the Armed Services Committee. His report played a major role in the preparation of a study that Senators Nunn and Bartlett was from Oklahoma, presented to the Senate entitled NATO and the New Soviet Threat. The report contained a number of steps necessary to improve NATO defense capabilities. These steps mirrored the findings and recommendations from Holly's report to Senator Nunn, and many of them would be subsequently adopted, thereby increasing NATO's viability. Holly continued to remain engaged in defense debates after his retirement, particularly with regard to military policy in both Europe and Korea. During his retirement, Holly was also very much involved with his alma mater, Texas A&M University. He was a dedicated fan of Aggie football, as we all are, and went to many games. He was also very active with the Corps Cadets, serving as a mentor to the cadets and as an advisor to the Corps leadership. The students were enthralled with this old warrior who was convivial, approachable, and could always tell a good story. In 1988, tragedy struck the Hollingsworths again when Nikki became ill with cancer. She died on 4 March 1989. Throughout Holly's military career, she had always been known as Mrs. H and was loved and admired by all who knew her. She was buried in the Fort Sam National Cemetery, and the remains of their son, Jamie, were removed from Sanger, Texas Cemetery and reinterred alongside his mother at Fort Sam, Houston. On 24 March 1990, Holly married his second wife, Janie Harris, who he had long known since his early days in the Pentagon. In addition to working at the Pentagon, Janie had been the personal secretary of Texas Governor Bill Clements for 18 years, first when he was official at the Pentagon, and then at his Sedco business in Dallas, and later in Austin when Clements spent 2 years as governor. Holly and Janie were inseparable for the rest of their lives. In September 1999, Texas A&M and the Corps Cadets paid Holly a singular honor when a statue was erected in his honor in the Corps Cadets area. The statue was a 7-foot tall likeness showing him in full battle gear and fatigues with a pistol strapped to his side, the way he spent most of his life in war. The 3,000-pound block of granite that formed the base of the statue bears the inscription Danger 79er, his Vietnam call sign. An accompanying plaque reads, "He was revered by his troops and feared by the enemy as a warrior who was always on the scene in times of need or at times of immense peril." The general, visibly moved by the tribute, gave a rousing but largely politically incorrect speech, typically Hollingsworth, that left the cadets cheering wildly. It was a great day for all involved, and I feel fortunate to have been a part of it. Here you can see him reviewing the troops, and that's a picture of the general and Janie and several of us who worked for him in Vietnam. Lieutenant General James F. Hollingsworth passed away quietly at the age of 91 on 2 March 2010, Texas Independence Day. He was buried with full military honors in Arlington Cemetery on 20 May 2010. The funeral was attended by soldiers from all over the United States who had served with the general and felt moved to travel to Washington to pay their respects to their old commander. A eulogy that appeared in the U.S. Army War College Alumni magazine says it best. Lieutenant General Holly was a soldier. He was no perfumed prince, nor a degreed dandy. He was an old-fashioned general who could talk to soldiers about something other than ice cream and mayo. He spoke their language, often melting the tin ear of eager staff officers. On the other hand, as chief of Army legislative liaison in the Pentagon, he could sit at a Senate tea party, pushing the Army programs with vigor and success. Those of us privileged to serve with him salute him proudly and smartly. The saber has been sheathed. His beloved Janie followed him in death on 9 May 2013 at the age of 92. Even after his passing, Hollingsworth continued to be recognized for his service to the nation. In December 2014, a new exhibit opened at the Bastogne War Museum in Belgium. Holly was one of 5 Texas A&M graduates whose World War II service was highlighted in the exhibit, which was titled, "From Texas to Bastogne, Texas Aggies Go to War." He and the other honorees represented the 20,000 Aggies that served in World War II. It was a fitting tribute to one of America's greatest soldiers. I happened to, along with my brother, when I was researching this book, we went to France. And we went to Normandy and followed the track of the 2nd Armored Division all the way to Bastogne. Arriving in Bastogne, we were wandering around the square there in the city, and we came upon this museum, which had this display. Being an Aggie, I thought it was most appropriate. My brother, 8 years younger than me, who was a Louisiana Tech graduate, was totally gobsmacked to find this story about Aggies in Bastogne. But he got over it. Hollingsworth is also remembered in the exhibit in the Sanders Corps Center on the campus of Texas A&M. Lieutenant General James S. Hollingsworth was a remarkable man, one of America's true heroes. He was a dynamic and colorful individual who was made for war, and his like will never be seen again, most probably. Lauren, this completes my presentation. I'll be glad to address any questions any of the listeners or viewers might have.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for sharing the story of a Texan in World War II and beyond. I have a question that I'd like to go ahead and get us started with. I was wondering if you could speak to his education and training that he received at Texas A&M and how that might have affected his actions in World War II and post-World War II.
Well, at that particular time, actually, I was the first class that did not have to be, I began in 65, did not have to be in the Corps of Cadets. Prior to that, everyone that went to A&M had to spend 2 years in the Corps of Cadets. And of course, in the Corps of Cadets, you got basic leadership training. The students were all the leadership in the units. The cadets were housed by units, company-sized units, and the leadership was all cadets. So basically, it was a leadership laboratory for young college kids. And it's very formative. It certainly was for me, the 4 years that I spent there. And when I was commissioned a second lieutenant, as Hollingsworth was, I was not starting at the same place that a lot of other ROTC graduates started. we had already had some pretty good lessons in leadership prior to being commissioned. And I think that was probably true for Hollingsworth as well. He also was very active in intramurals. He studied, at one point, he was thinking about being a veterinarian, so he was taking some pretty serious courses. And he was also getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to work at the creamery on post. So he was pretty driven even then as a cadet.
Okay, we have a question from our at-home audience. First off, they say outstanding presentation. Um, and their question is back to North Africa. Any comments on Rommel's Panzer Division?
I did not find any of that in any of my research with regard to the Second Armored. The Second Armored was not one of the leading units there that was involved in some of the heaviest fighting, and they would not see the heaviest fighting that the division was involved in until they got to Europe, to Normandy. So I didn't see any. I do know in several cases there were some meeting engagements that he was involved in. I know in one case he took charge of, and he was not a company or battalion commander at the time. He was a maintenance officer, and at one point he just gathered 5 tanks together and they attacked a German position and overran it. So he was not a shy retiring violet. His idea was, when in charge, take charge, and if nobody else is in charge, he would assume command.
Okay, I want to make sure that everybody else caught this during your presentation, so I'm going to bring it up again. But can you speak to your personal experiences with him?
Uh, he was the head of all advisors in Military Region 3. There were 3 ARVN divisions, and each one of the ARVN divisions had a small advisory team with them. The divisions were the 5th, the 18th, and the 25th. I was in the 18th ARVN division. I was an infantry officer. So that meant that I was an advisor with an infantry battalion or regiment. And I happened to be in one of the regiments that was involved in the battle at An Loc. So I was on the ground for most of the battle. I came out for a short period of time, and then I was wounded for the second time in July, on July the 9th, 1972, and that was the end of my part there. Uh, I stayed in country for another couple of months. I've always been fond of General Hollingsworth because he gave me an extra R&R and sent me to Thailand after I got out of the hospital. So I've always been a fan. And then I got to know him later after we both retired. And I wrote a book about the Battle of An Loc, and I had conversed with him at great lengths, of course, about that and the research. And I said, sir, no one's ever written a biography about you, and I'd like to write one sometime if you want to talk about that. And he's very gruffly, he was a very gruff individual, said, I'm not interested, and you can do what you want to after I'm dead, but I'm not participating while I'm alive.
Okay. We have a few more questions coming in from our at-home audience. So first one up is, did he help in the rescue of the 101st Airborne?
In the sense that the Second Armored was one of the relieving outfits that got there and attacked one of the shoulders, yes.
And then our next question is, what was his opinion about his enemies? He had to deal with several military strategies employed from World War II to Vietnam. Okay, so in general, what was his opinion of his enemy, and how did his strategies change over time?
Well, I think like many of the senior officers in Vietnam who were World War II veterans, their approach to fighting the war in Vietnam was certainly impacted by their experiences in World War II. And some would tell you that Westmoreland was a World War II general, and that's how he tried to fight Vietnam. That's perhaps a discussion for another time. I don't necessarily agree with that. Um, Hollingsworth was a single-minded individual. If the guy on the other side was the enemy, his job was to kill him, and as quickly and as thoroughly as he could, whether they were Germans or North Vietnamese or Viet Cong. And his strategy was to do whatever it took to get the job done. And if that meant he had to get out of a Jeep waving a 45 and say, follow me into the farm to clear out snipers, that's what he did.
Okay, that is all the questions that we have. If anybody has any lingering questions, you have a few seconds to get those into the chat box before we close out. But again, I want to say thank you to everybody at home and to Jim for doing this presentation. I know we stepped a little outside of the Pacific Theater, but we thought it was important to share the story of a Texan who went to A&M, went through the Corps, and then had an illustrious military career. So we're really glad that everybody joined us for tonight. Oh, we do have another question. So before we close out, one last question. Uh, did Holly and Cretan Adams know each other at the relief of Bastogne?
I don't believe they knew each other then. If they knew each other, it was by reputation because they were both armor officers and both up and coming. Certainly, they got to know each other later in life, and Abrams was the MACV commander when Hollingsworth was the Military Region 3 senior advisor in 72 when I was there. And so that was most important during the battle for An Loc because in some cases, Hollings was able to go directly to Abrams around the staff and say, for instance, on the lead up to the last battle there, last major battle on 10 May, as you know, Abe, I need all the B-52 strikes you can give me because we're fixing to have the biggest battle we've ever had. And Abe thought so much of him that he knew he was telling him the truth. And then he took the B-52s away from some of the other places that they were already targeted against and said, okay, you've got to make good use of them, which he did. And it ultimately broke the back of the final attack by the North Vietnamese troops on 10 May.
Okay, I know I said that was the last question, but we got another one, and so let's go ahead and go for that. Did Hollingsworth have any interactions with General Maurice Rose, another fighting general?
I didn't come across that in the research, but I think they're very similar in approach to basically lead from the front, get the job done, take care of your troops, and accomplish the mission. And that's what Hollingsworth was all about. As many of those World War II generals, particularly the really good ones, um, tried to do later in the war. And you saw a number of those. General Depew was greatly impacted by his experience in World War II. And it wasn't always a positive experience. He was with a unit that was not very good. And his whole approach from that point on was to make sure that we never put a division in the field like the one that he started serving in that was largely demolished by the Germans.
Okay, so I think now we are going to wrap it up for the evening. Again, thank you to our at-home audience, and thank you to Jim for sharing this story and your personal connection to Holly. We really appreciate that, and I know I learned a lot about his story and his experiences, and I'm sure our at-home audience did. Um, Before we go, I want to remind everybody that we will be kicking off the next season of webinars in January with a webinar about the book, The Old Breed. We will have both of the authors with us for that webinar. Again, that'll be Wednesday, January 15th. So please don't forget to register for it. And I would like to say thank you so much for joining us for tonight and for this season of Untold Stories, and we'll see you in 2025.